So when we talk about the nervous system is a very broad definition, right? So the nervous system uh, involves our body's ability to communicate with our spinal cord and brain, and it that electrochemical communication process that we talked about, the nervous system is what facilitates it. Now, we have two different parts, right? So if I were to take the nervous system as a flow chart at the top, I would subdivide the nervous system into our central nervous system and our peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system, we will see, refers to the brain and the spinal cord, whereas the peripheral nervous system refers to everything else. Now, within the peripheral nervous system, we have subdivisions as well. We have a somatic and autonomic subdivision, so voluntary versus involuntary functioning. And then even within the autonomic nervous system, we have a subdivision of sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So we'll get there. So this is kind of the flow chart or the subdivisions of the nervous system I want you to visualize. And for the test, I want you to be able to understand the elements of each, right? So let's talk about the central nervous system. The central nervous system is comprised of the brain and spinal cord, as I said. But because I have a whole section on the various brain structures, I'm going to put that to the side for now, right? Let's talk about the spinal cord. The spinal cord has 5 levels. So you have the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal levels of the spinal cord. And I put it in order from top to bottom. So your cervical spinal cord is at the top of your spinal cord and connects directly to your medulla. And then we work from cervical to thoracic, working our way down the spinal cord. Lumbar is in your lower back, sacral even further down, and coccygeal is where your tailbone is. But we have a series of vertebrae for each. So if you ever did neuroimaging, you might hear, oh, that person has a lesion at C4. What does that mean? That means they have a lesion in the cervical spinal cord, the 4th vertebrae, right? So it's important to understand. Now, because the cervical spinal cord is closest to the medulla, those are the injuries that are the most life-threatening. So if a person has damage to C1, C2, C3, they run the risk of also having heart functioning problems, respiratory function problems, and ultimately death. And there was an actor, Christopher Reeve, who played Superman, and he was riding his horse and fell over and caused damage to the cervical spinal cord. And there was a significant amount of angst that he might die. Now, in the end, he didn't die from his injury, but he became a quadriplegic. Now, why is that? Well, each part of the spinal cord will affect different body parts. And when you have a lesion higher up, it affects everything below it. So a lesion in the cervical spinal cord is going to affect your ability to control both your upper and lower extremities. Whereas if a person has a lesion to their lumbar or sacral spinal cord, they're more likely going to have problems with their lower extremities exclusively. So if we look at this, here's a series of pictures. I think they're good to paint the picture, right? Our cervical spinal cord, if you look on the left, it shows you what it controls. So the cervical spinal cord is going to control your head, neck region, and your arms. Then you have your thoracic, which is your central chestal cavity, which is going to control the upper body. And then you have your lumbar and sacral spinal cord, which covers or affects your lower extremities. Now, related to this, I guess it makes sense to talk about the concept of an epidural and what's referred to as a spinal tap. If I were to ask you which one is more risky, what would you say? An epidural or a spinal tap?
Spinal Tap.
Right? Most people default to a spinal tap, but believe it or not, a spinal tap, they're oftentimes injecting the needle below the spinal cord. So if you could see my cursor on the right, the in the gray, the dark gray is your spinal cord, and then there's some space below the spinal cord, right? And they're going to draw what's called cerebrospinal fluid from there. So if they're injecting below the spinal cord, there is less of a risk of spinal damage. Whereas an epidural, they're oftentimes injecting in the lumbar or sacral level. And that's oftentimes given, for example, when people are giving birth, right? To deal with the pain in the lower extremities, a person giving birth might say, hey, I want an epidural. Because as we will see, we'll talk about it in our developmental psychology lecture, a first birth takes a long time. On average, it's about 18 hours or something around there, 12 to 18 hours. So you're having contractions several minutes apart and you're not even dilated. So you're going to have a lot of pain in the lower extremities. So people do an epidural, but the injection goes into the spinal cord directly, which means that there's a greater risk of damage. So that's the spinal cord, right? Well, as I said, we'll talk about the different parts of the brain separately. But let's get into the peripheral nervous system. I said the central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is everything else, basically. So the peripheral nervous system has a very critical function. It serves to connect the central nervous system with the rest of the body. And the first subdivision that I talked to you about was somatic versus autonomic functioning. Now, somatic functioning refers to things that we typically have voluntary control over. Things like our muscles and glands, that would be somatic functioning. Autonomic functioning refers to things that are involuntary. That means that we don't necessarily need to control them. They happen naturally. Doesn't mean we cannot control them. Of course, we can control them. For example, an autonomic function is respiration or breathing. Can one actively control their breathing? Yes. But do we need to tell ourselves, generally speaking, okay, it's time to breathe? No. Do we need to tell our heart, okay, it's time to beat? Or do we need to tell our digestive system, okay, it's time to extract the nutrients and eliminate the waste? We don't think about that. Our body naturally does it. And that's what we mean by autonomic functioning. It's more of a natural involuntary functioning. Okay. So let's talk about autonomic functioning. This happens naturally. Now, what's interesting is we have something called the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, you might hear the sympathetic nervous system referred to as the fight, flight, or freeze reaction that we have. So the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for helping us cope with a reasonable threat or a stressful situation. And when we perceive danger, alarm bells go off, right? And we protect ourselves against the danger. So what is oftentimes released is adrenaline, right? So we have increased energy. And I'm going to talk more about what also happens during these processes as well in a minute. But I want to touch on the parasympathetic nervous system as well. So if the sympathetic nervous system deals with dangerous or threatening situations or stressful situations, the parasympathetic nervous system deals with non-threatening situations. So you might hear the parasympathetic nervous system referred to as rest and digest. So the parasympathetic nervous system allows us to relax, allows us to sleep, allows us to digest our food. And generally speaking, one is in control and one is subservient. So when you're in a threatening situation, the sympathetic nervous system takes over and the parasympathetic nervous system shuts off. When you're in a non-threatening situation, the parasympathetic nervous system takes over and the sympathetic nervous system shuts off. And they work in antagonism to one another. It's kind of like the yin and the yang. But you need both, because if you only had one, you would die, right? So the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system are crucial for survival. Now, what are some things that happen when a person perceives a threat? What happens in the body? What are some changes you notice when you perceive threat? Say it again.
It can be a heartbeat.
Okay,
It
good.
can be cold sweat,
What happens? Your heart beats
anxiety.
fast.
Yeah.
You wet? Well, what's the function of the heart beating faster? Well, the heart is responsible for pumping blood to your vital organs. And if you're trying to survive a threatening situation, you want to pump that blood, the oxygenated blood, properly. Respiration, breathing, people can hyperventilate, right? Similar to the heart, it's responsible for oxygenating and pumping that oxygenated blood. Sweating, you mentioned sweating. That's to cool down your core body temperature to promote survival. What else happens? Anyone else?
Get on
Casey.
fight mode.
Well, yeah, it's called fight or flight, but what are some of the body reactions? Casey.
Body starts to shake.
Maybe possible shivering. What happens with the eyes?
I'm not sure.
Widen,
dilate,
the iris
right?
is widen. Yeah.
The eyes dilate. Now, your eyes are like mini cameras in for your body. So when you dilate, it opens up and receives more light and more information to promote survival. Your blood vessels constrict, similar to a garden hose. When you put your thumb on part of it, the blood pressure increases. And all of this is designed to help you deal with a potentially dangerous situation. Now, your muscle tense up, and we take muscle tension for granted, but we didn't always live in houses the way we do. And one of our biggest threats were animal predators. And what does muscle tension do? It makes it harder for an animal to rip through your tissue, right? So there's a whole host of things that happen during the fight or flight response. Now, when you go out of that dangerous situation, everything goes back to normal. You have reduced heart rate, reduced sweating, increased digestion, and so forth, right? Now, I didn't talk about digestion in sympathetic nervous system because it shuts down. Imagine you went on a safari and you are doing a picnic at a nature reserve and you lay out your picnic basket for lunch and then you see a lion. Are you going to say to that lion, hold on, give me 30 minutes, I'm eating lunch before you chase me? No, you're going to dart out of there. Your appetite is going to be gone and you're going to save your life because your body knows that if it doesn't shut down the need for hunger and digestion, instead of eating lunch, you're going to be lunch for that lion, right? So, yeah, it slows down our digestion, slows down hunger in a sympathetic nervous system. But in a parasympathetic nervous system, we're calm. So now the digestion comes back. Now the hunger sensations return. So now we're able to sleep and relax. So they work together. I see there's something in the chat. Yeah, there's adrenaline, right? Adrenaline is released. So I said to you in general, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system work in antagonism. And one is going to be in control more than the other. Let me prove this or show this through another example. I want you to imagine that you're at the college and you're taking a night class. And the class ends roughly at 10 p.m. And you leave the class. And then you start to hear footsteps. Hearing those footsteps are going to signal a potential threat. So what might you do? Come on, follow the scenario. What might you do?
You go faster.
You walk faster. Now I want you to continue. I'm going to take you as an example, Leah, right? Because you're answering nicely. So you walk faster and they start walking faster. What are you doing next?
Then you run.
You run. They start running. So now you've run to your car. You get to your car and you're fidgeting with your keys. And you drop your keys right out of a horror film. And as you're bending down to pick up your keys, the person catches up to you and says, hey, Leah, I'm sorry, but you left your notebook in class. And they hand you your notebook. What happens in the body at that point?
Your body comes down and
You have a big sigh of relief.
yeah, big breath.
You might have the jitters a little bit, but your heart rate slows down. Your breathing slows down. And generally, immediately after they hand you your book and say, you forgot it in the classroom, you know you're no longer in threat. So immediately the parasympathetic nervous system says, thank you, but I have it from here. Isn't that cool? Like it happens on a daily basis when we perceive and then reconcile a perceived threat. We don't have to think about it. And that's the beauty of the autonomic nervous system. Now, I said in general, one is in control and the other is kind of taking a step back. There is one exception, which is interesting psychologically. When it comes to sexual intercourse, you actually have both active, right? Because if a person has an overly excited sympathetic nervous system, that's going to interfere with performance. But there has to be enough of an arousal to be able to perform. So outside of sexual intercourse, typically it's either the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system which takes over. So that's our nervous system. Any thoughts, reactions, or questions to that? Okay. So what we're going to do next is we're going to talk about different parts of the brain. And I don't think I'm going to get through all of it, but I will, like, I'll do the mini divisions that I'm doing. My goal in the next recording is to cover just the hindbrain, midbrain, and thalamus. And you might ask, well, why do I put them together? Because elements of these are linked to the brainstem. So let me stop this recording to make it its own as well.